people I know on this call. And a few new faces and names. So thanks for joining us. So a few things. Let's see here. I'll start with a little bit more background about myself. So my name is Eric Rucker. I wear several hats. I am a full-time campus chaplain at Simpson College in Indianola, Iowa, just south of Des Moines. And there I also direct a program called the Simpson Youth Academy that Amy mentioned. That's a program that's an ecumenical program where we bring high school students from throughout the state to our campus to live and learn during the summer on faith, social justice, leadership, vocational discernment. So I work with high school students in the summers and then support them in their local churches throughout the year. You will be hearing me talk about that again when I plug it at the end and ask you to please help me recruit students. So I work for Simpson College and the Youth Academy full time. And I've done that for 9 years. I'm also an ordained Episcopal priest, or I work very part-time at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Des Moines, Iowa. I live in Des Moines with my family. Hannah is my wife. We've done some foster care over the years. And then right now we have 2 biological children in our house under 4 years old. So please pray for us about that as well. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about youth mental health, and I'm bringing all those experiences, right? We've had probably more than 200 high school students come through our program. So sharing 8 years of working with high schoolers and early college students, sharing my own anecdotes about parenting, and then just being around the local church and connecting with folks in the local church, as well as a number of other books and podcast resources that I might mention throughout. Anything else I need to say? I will pause a number of times to let folks jump in. We'll see, but I kind of tried to keep this a little bit sparse of information. I want to present some prompts, but then also open it up to the room because we have a lot of wisdom in this room. And so whether you want to use the chat or unmute and talk, my hope is also just to mine for some wisdom from this group to hear like what's working, what isn't working in our different settings. So I'm happy to have this be a dialogue, right, or a conversation in that spirit. So those are a couple of background pieces, and yeah, we can get started. So this is a mental health, obviously lunch and learn, and I was invited to talk about the intersection of mental health issues and primarily working with teenagers. I'm going to share my screen. Let me share my screen on and off here. So see here, lunch and learn. All right. Cool. Okay. So a couple things I wanted to mention up front. I wanted to give a sort of trigger or content warning when we're talking about mental health. It's pretty likely that some other difficult topics will come up. I know towards the second half, especially of this presentation, there's going to be some mentions of rape and sexual assault. And so I want you to know that that's something that's coming as part of our conversation about mental health, and do whatever you need to do to care for yourself. Amy also mentioned that this is being recorded and will be shared. And so usually if I'm just in a live room with people, I ask for a covenant of confidentiality. We're not going to do that here because this is going to be online. But I'm going to be sharing, I think some relatively vulnerable kind of anecdotes, right, and pieces from things I see in families and students' lives. And obviously I'm not going to use names or identifiers, but just ask you to be thoughtful, right? And maybe not like screenshot this and put it on social media or something, right? Just be gentle with what I'm going to be sharing because it's real people's lives, right? So just invite us to be thoughtful about that. I have a longer resource list that I'd be happy to share with you if you want to email me or something. But if you wanted to get started somewhere on the topics of youth mental health, youth and mental health, the kind of go-to 3 that I would recommend are these 3. One of them is called The End of Youth Ministry by Andy Root, who's a professor at Luther in Minnesota. The second one, that's just a picture of one book from a larger organization called the Springtide Institute. I would highly recommend you checking out the Springtide Institute. It's kind of like Pew Research, except they focus primarily on youth youth and spirituality. So they have tons of great resources. And kind of as an asterisk under that, they just launched something called, I think it's called Future of Faith. So Springtide Institute and Future of Faith, you can Google those. They have a lot of great resources. And then finally, you've probably heard about this one, but this is probably my favorite read of the last couple of years. The Anxious Generation, I think is also really interesting and provocative and helpful. Those are three, if you wanted to go a little bit deeper, resources that I have appreciated and what I'll be drawing on for some of this presentation. All right. So my kind of pattern that I was thinking about for this presentation was I just wanted to sort of break up conversation into when I think about teenagers in our lives, what's a life experience they're having that might lead to mental health issues? What are some of the impacts we're noticing? And then what are some of the responses? So kind of those three movements. I'm going to apply those three categories to a couple of different life experiences. And then solicit your responses. So I'm just going to dive in. So the first one that comes to mind, and probably the one that I at this point believe is the strongest variable that's leading to increased mental health issues, is most of these young people grew up around and with smartphones and algorithm-based social media. So if you don't know that term, algorithm-based social media, I'm going to give the best definition I can, not being a tech person. So an algorithm is a particular kind of code or way that an app or program runs. So you think of TikTok or you think of Instagram or Facebook, those are algorithm based. And what that means is they have a tool that pays attention to every decision you make on that app, and then it learns who you are, right? So it's learning every time you swipe, every time you like something, every time you dislike something, even monitoring, oh, how long did this person stop on this, right? And when you stop on something, then you'll notice you start to get ads for it, right? So it's this robot that learns us and then feeds us more of what's going to keep us engaged on that app. It's a behavior modification tool. And so we know for sure that that's changing the chemistry of young people's brains. And it's important to say, technology, I feel like we're just at the beginning of developing literacy. Like, how do we even talk about technology, and all the intricacies of it? And so I want to invite us even to think about not making like blanket statements about technology, because there are a huge range of technologies and they have very different effects on our brains and children's brains. So if a child is FaceTiming, that does different things to their brain than if they are on an iPad for 3 hours, right, unobserved. We know through statistics that are like through experiments that affects the brain differently. So I wanted to name not just smartphones, but maybe the most particularly damaging part of like having a smartphone as a young person is the algorithm-based social media, or the thing that creates the most addiction and dysregulation. So I want to start with that life experience of being around and or having smartphones and algorithm-based social media. So the first impact that I wanted to name sort of has two parts, and this language has been helpful for me to nuance it and say, a few sociologists I've read have said kind of two categories of impact that happen. One is displacement. And so when you think about that means there's an effect that you can just think of as math, right? If you're a young person and you grew up without a phone, you get to spend X amount of hours doing essential activities that help you develop, help your brain develop. So that's like free play, that is sleeping enough sometimes, that is engaging on the playground or in a space where it's like you learn to navigate conflict, you learn sense of humor, you learn to be attuned to other people and all the nonverbal things, right? That's learned over thousands and thousands of hours of interacting with each other as children. And so then you think about, okay, if a child grows up with a phone in their hand and they're spending X amount of hours on the phone instead of on the playground or instead of running around the neighborhood, we only have so many hours in our childhood. And so that means that the time that these children would have spent doing essential learning, social learning, is being displaced by time on phones, right? So it's like minus 1,500 hours plus 1,500 hours. So it even unrelated to the content that they engage with on the phone, there's a simple math that says young people we're guessing that part of why young people have mental health issues related to phones is because they simply haven't been able to like allocate hours to the social learning that they used to, right, when they weren't on their phones. Does that make sense? So that's displacement. That's one thing. And then the second thing that's a different category is content. Um, just losing the hours of social learning can be a problem. But then we're also continuing to have revelations about the content that young people have had access to. And some of that is related to policies that really haven't been updated in the United States. Like we don't have very strong federal or state policies around holding social media companies accountable for what young people are allowed to look at. So I believe right now you simply have to start certain accounts, at least for like the first 15 years of smartphones, you could simply check, yes, I'm above 13, and you just had to check a box, right? And so what that means is you could be 12 years old on a phone and see hardcore pornography, pull up videos of like animal torture, be open to getting direct messages from strangers and predators online, bullying, propaganda, etc. So there's a content problem too, is because young brains exposed to a lot of that is going to have an effect. So I just kind of wanted to start with the basics and say those are two impacts of algorithm-based social media on teens is the time it takes away from the social learning, and then also some of the more sort of toxic and damaging content. So I wanted to lift up at least one response that we've been noticing in our ministries can be helpful for that, and that's deep listening activities. So part of our thought has been, okay, well, if a lot of young people have grown up um, with a deficit of social learning, they haven't been around, they don't know what it looks like or feels like to listen or be listened to in person. Well, how can we use our tradition to kind of teach some of that in a way that they aren't getting in social spaces? So deep listening is, I think, one thing that I imagine could be transferable to like a local church or youth ministry space, deep listening activities. And so you just having in mind that that's like kind of a foreign experience for many young people, right? Like being listened to in person. So I wanted to just put this up here. I think there's a lot of different ways, creative ways, everybody on this call could implement a commitment to deep listening with young people. And these are just some best practices I use, like when I'm training staff, right, who are going to work with youth. And I have a whole handout that I'd walk through and give them. But things like, these are skills like mirroring, which means you're saying back to the person something they said to you, detecting patterns or noticing keywords, right? That's like, oh, I heard you say like aggravated several times. Like, tell me more about that, right? Asking follow-up questions, learning to ask follow-up questions is an art skill that has to be developed. Joining, that's a way that you connect with somebody without taking over, right? You're like, I heard you say that you were really struggling with this thing that happened this week. I can join you in that because it's really been bothering me too, right? That's joining. And silence, like learning to model silence and holding silent space with the young person. So that's just a kind of the tip of the iceberg, but I can see lots of ways that deep listening could be integrated into ministry. It could be something that you're just working on, right? That you bring to young people. Another thing that we found really powerful is sort of trying to shape a culture of deep listening. And so if you're leading a Sunday school class or you're at a coffee shop in a Bible study or whatever, you can pull back the curtain and teach young people these skills, right? It doesn't have to be a secret, right? And so like talking with young people about listening and letting them practice. Like even if you just, we do activities where it's like I present these and then I ask a prompt question, like what have you been learning about yourself this week? Or how did you feel when this happened? And then you could like break them into pairs and say, we're going to practice deep listening with each other, right? You have 5 minutes. One person's going to share for 2.5 minutes. The other person's going to share for 2.5 minutes. And you're both going to practice deep listening when you're the listener, right? So that's just one little anecdote, but I think that's a way that we're trying to compensate for all the lost social learning, right? All that all that time where they haven't gotten the chance to listen and be listened to seems like a one possible response to that with the ways the algorithms are maybe not helpful for them. This is from Future of Faith, but they interviewed Gen Z and millennials, and 67% said I grow in my faith and spirituality when someone listens to me talk without judgment, as opposed to 33% who said I grow in my faith or spirituality when I hear a sermon. So I don't think that means we should stop having sermons. I think it just speaks to the hunger that young people have to be listened to, right? And that in itself is ministry, and maybe opens the door to them being willing to even listen to a sermon if that's going to happen. So, and similarly, 70% said I trust someone more when they listen to me and follow up than just when they tell me their own thoughts or ideas. So these are kind of no-brainers, but just a little bit of like statistical support for that. Okay, I'm going to talk about another response. So we're still talking about the life experience of phones, and we know some of the impacts. So I named deep listening as one of the responses. Another response that I've kind of noticed and in our ministry and heard about in other ministries is needing to provide what I would call structured free time for young people. I kind of get a sense that, I hope that as Christian ministries, we're not offering something that feels exactly like any of the other extracurricular activities. It is different. But I've noticed even in the 9 years I've been in ministry, we used to give young people in the summer more unstructured free time, like 3 or 4 hours in the afternoon, that I honestly felt like pre-pandemic and kind of pre-digital natives, like pre-smartphone kids, they enjoyed that more and could handle it more. And in COVID and post-COVID, I've noticed that having that much time, I'm getting a lot more complaints about why isn't there anything to do during this time? And so that's just something we've had to do to modify, is almost like give them some guardrails for like, how do you make friends? Like, how do you socialize? How do you build relationships? Because my sense is anecdotally, there's still a hunger for that relationship and that intimacy, but there's not necessarily like there haven't been the skills built to get into that. It's like all I do is like I think sometimes it feels like they only know how to show up and feel the anxiety and then bail out sometimes. And so I think part of what we're noticing is, so we still have the unstructured free time in our summer program, but we're like, we need to build in some optional activities, right? We're going to go get ice cream together. We're going to do yoga together. And so those are almost like containers that it's like, okay, we helped them sit at a table together and we helped get the conversation started, and now they're talking to each other, right? So there's just a little picture of some unstructured or some structured free time with high school students. They just need I found generally they need a little bit more structure to build those relationships that they're really hungering for. I'm going to say one more and then I'm going to pause for questions and comments. Another impact, so one more impact of the smartphone algorithm-based social media is diminished attention span, and that's something I've definitely seen in real life and experienced as an adult, but also have read it like several of those resources naming. In terms of studies, we're seeing that that's statistically the case. This one I think sometimes can be challenging to implement, but I think prayer practices are a vital part of what we offer as a response to diminished attention span, and helping young people not be intimidated by that, but leading them into that, I think can be one of the greatest gifts we're giving them. And I'm finding that Christian practices, the more eccentric and kind of out of control and fast-paced culture gets, the more profound the prayer practices seem in comparison. Like the less like the faster we're moving in our culture, the more profound it seems to sit in silence for 2 minutes as a spiritual practice. And so I just am naming a couple of these here that you can explore, but I do think like slowly over time we can create a culture where young people actually come to enjoy and hunger for spiritual practice. And so that could be like the Divina, like creative, engaging ways to mark up a passage, right? And circle and underline and engage a passage of scripture. That could be like prayer walking. That could be prayer of examination, which is kind of like a journaling activity to think about their day. We have a thing that we do called technology Sabbath, which is like we frame what Sabbath is and then we implement it at the beginning of prayer or worship or listening time. So there's a lot of room for creativity there, but yeah, I think that prayer practices there are spiritual technologies that are a response to the damages of like contemporary technologies. Catherine Lee said incorporating nonverbal listening as well. Yeah, thank you, Catherine. I think that's one of the things that naturally comes up when you talk to youth about what does good and bad listening look like. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I just gave you a bunch of information, and I just wanted to open it to the group. I'm naming the life experience of young people growing up on social media. I'm naming a few impacts. And I want to open it up to the group and say, is there anything else you're noticing that has been successful in terms of responses? Like if we're trying to mitigate the damage of mental health and from smartphones and disciple them into a more healthy way of being. Anything else you're noticing? Ways of relating, formation activities, programming, anything else working for y'all?
I've been doing youth ministry for about 20 years now, which is scary to consider that long. But early on, we became aware that we had youth who were texting to each other about someone else in the room. And we learned that we couldn't police that very well. So for probably at least 15 years now, we kind of have a no cell phone policy out, like allowed in our youth groups. We lock them in a room when they come. In the first time or two, they we get a lot of resistance. And after that, we don't even have to ask them to put them away. And they talk about they really learn to look forward to that time without it. Every once in a while, we'll get together with another church who, like at snack time, they're allowed to have their phones, and they'll look at me and they'll say, Jen, they don't even know how to talk to each other. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes we can be afraid to just put that hard line in and say, for this hour, it's 1 hour. You're just going to talk to each other. And so and now someone had just posted about sorry, I'm looking at the name, the Anxious Generation book that you had up. And I've received a lot of pushback from others, even within youth ministry settings, that we have that no technology rule. And they say instead, try to incorporate Kahoots and other things. But this has just really worked for us. And like I said, when you start hearing particularly middle schoolers who are so attached to their phones and so attached to screen that they feel like they get 1 hour a week without it, and that alone sometimes is their favorite hour of the week, I think we just really need to examine what we're allowing, and not be afraid to just say, hey, like I loved your Sabbath, technology Sabbath. It doesn't always have to be all or nothing. That's what has worked for us, but don't be afraid to take that technology Sabbath for today and help them learn to be kids.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to read a couple of these chat. We've introduced prayer stations. It's a favorite in our children's ministry with youth, and youth are beginning to love it. Visio Divina, so that's kind of praying through art with kids and grown-ups. Danny said, one thing that has helped me recently is trying to attend events, games, and concerts, which has helped me build trust with youth and their families. Yeah, thank you, Danny. That's kind of the relational piece, that it starts with the listening and the receptivity. Let me take one or two more comments, then I'm going to move on. Anything else y'all want to add?
If I
Daniel?
may kind of piggyback on what Jennifer just said, as someone that's been involved in youth ministry for a very long time, I kind of straddle the ages on this one, you know. So electronics were just becoming a thing when I was first getting involved, and it was evident to me after just a few times that once electronics were so prevalent, there was a hunger for real community, and we'd have an event, and where it used to take kids from different congregations about a day and a half to melt together into a community. They were so desperate for it that it took about 10 minutes. Putting down the phones and having actual contact and conversation, and just know that there was acceptance in the room. So I think, you know, one of the very basic things we can do is offer more opportunities for them to get together. I know COVID did a terrible thing for our diocese with you know, kind of diminishing our opportunities for youth to get together, our youth events and everything like that. You know, they took a big hit. So finding ways to have more opportunities to gather, I think, is very therapeutic.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to move in so we get to everything. One other, John, I'm just thinking one other anecdote that was stuck out to me so much. I was on vacation at Lake Okoboji, and I was sitting in like a common area of this hotel, and there were these middle schoolers playing pool together, and they were talking about like trying to learn to water ski, and they were like, how did it go today? How did it go this morning? And one of them to the other one was like, well, like you were on your phone, you know, so you weren't like really focused. And then he was like, have you ever heard of be in the moment? And he did like quotes around it. And they were like, what's be in the moment? It was like a commercial, basically. And he was like, be in the moment. It's where you like put down your phone and you're just like in the moment. Which it was so interesting because I was both like, this is kind of sad because that's not the baseline. This is like an external idea now. But it was also like he was kind of evangelizing the other kids into like, you can be in the moment. So I just thought that so encapsulated what we're talking about. It was fascinating. But be in the moment. You should check it out. Try it out. Okay. We're going to keep moving. I'm going to name another kind of experience. Share. Okay. I wanted to name one other thing that I'm noticing that I got some language around that I'm finding quite helpful. Something else that I've become aware of and notice sometimes is the way in which growing up online and growing up on social media apps can create a fear of learning and vulnerability and risk. If you think about if you're a young person and you watch somebody maybe do something embarrassing or try something, and then somebody captures it on a phone, right? They capture a video, they take a picture, and they post it. That can be like social death, right? Like if you get caught doing something that's embarrassing, that's huge. That's a huge risk for you socially. And so I heard somebody doing an interview the other day name it in a way that I found so helpful. This is Ocean Vuong. He's a writer and a professor, I think, in New England. But this is kind of him naming the changes he's noticed in students over the last few years. So I'm going to read it. It's about cringe. So you might have heard young people say, that's so cringe, right? Like that's so embarrassing. So this is Ocean Vuong. He says, what I've noticed in an unsettling way is that American students are more and more self-conscious of trying. There's surveillance culture around social media. They would say, I want to be a poet, but it's a bit cringe. Cringe culture means I don't want to be perceived as trying, as having an effortful attempt at my dreams. As a teacher, that's a horrifying report from the field. They're scared of judgment, so they perform cynicism because cynicism can be misread as intelligence. You are too cool, you have seen it all, but in fact, they are deeply hungry for sincere, earnest effort. So I think I'd been intuiting that, but it was just so helpful to hear it put that way, like cringe culture as a sort of a surveillance culture. And, you know, in your teenage years, you're supposed to be logging all these hours where you make mistakes, you know, and you bump into people and you say the wrong thing and you learn to apologize, right? That's where you're supposed to be experimenting. And these apps have totally disincentivized that. So the things that teens need most, which is spaces for vulnerability, social experimentation, learning, connection, are places really just of paralysis and anxiety because you're worried about something coming back to haunt you. And so just the converse of those two ways of being in the world feels so important to me. I don't know exactly what to do about that, but I think it's important to notice. And to be thinking, you know, I named responses. A lot of times we use the concept of covenant, like before we have a conversation, before we have a small group. We have the students name a covenant, make a covenant together of values they want to bring to that conversation. And often that includes confidentiality. You know, often students name respect, trust. And so I think, how do we kind of at the very start, give them an alternative practice, which is like, this is going to be a space where I don't have to be scared to be open. We're promising not to tease each other or bully each other. And we're agreeing that this is going to be a time where we're learning together instead of trying to perform, you know, a certain facade for each other, which I think is like a huge gift of Christian community, like spaces where they can be themselves. And I found I put appropriate adult vulnerability because part of what I believe I've seen facilitates that kind of freedom for youth is if we can model that through like appropriate sharing of like, we're humans, we have questions about faith, we have struggles, we have mental health ups and downs, right? So it's just a thought about the fear of vulnerability and then maybe how we facilitate something different than that. Anybody want to add anything there that you've noticed, or the sort of cringe culture and how a Christian responds to that?
I spent a week at Rotary Youth Leadership Award conference, and there not only did the students not have they stayed in dorms, so they could have their phones in the dorm, but they weren't in the dorm until bedtime, and they were up very early. But one of the things that we also did was we covered as many clocks as possible because we really did want them to be in the moment. When they had activities that they were doing, a lot of times it'd be like, well, what time is it? Or how much time do we have for this activity? And we'd just be, you know what? Sometimes it's hard to live in the moment, but we'll let you know when we're done. You know, so just really trying to emphasize the importance of that. And I feel like that they really, after a week, I think that was one of the things that really was very positive in their growth.
Thank you. Yeah, Amy put in the chat, that language helps a lot, especially with three teenage children in my house who don't want to try new things as much as they used to. Right. Yeah.
Can you also talk about, so besides the cringe culture stuff, just perfectionist culture for kids who may be, you know, high achievers in school, or doing athletics that are competitive, marching band that's competitive, things like that. What effects you see with those kind of activities and what you would respond with that?
Yeah, so I can offer a few kind of initial wonderments. I think some things I've noticed. One of the things I've heard recently is I've met with our Simpson College school therapist or school psychologist, and maybe y'all have heard this language before, but she was talking about noticing with students that she sees there's a sort of traditional like how our brains respond to threat, like fight, flight, or freeze. And she said that like she's added a fourth one, which is fawn, like FAUN, which is sort of speaking about the ways and like of the propensity maybe of young people when they feel out of their depth or anxious. Another impulse is to sort of fawn, meaning like ingratiation, or just like if I can just like a kind of perfectionistic response, right? That's like, if I can just do exactly what this authority figure wants me to do, then maybe I'll be okay. So I think adding that like fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, it was just like an interesting addition of language for me, of like a way that she sees young people responding to anxiety through kind of perfectionism and achievement. Maybe I spelled fawn wrong. The fawn response has two subcategories: submit and attack. Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, so I'm a little bit out of my depth there, but that's from a psychologist that you could read more or consult a psychologist. I think that, I mean, the other things I was thinking of were the theological, I'm always sort of like, what does it mean for us as Christian people? What do we uniquely offer? And we're not an extracurricular, we're not a marching band, we're not a dance recital, we're not a social club. And when we try to be those things, I think we kind of suck at it, because it's not what we're offering. And so a couple of things I've found in response to to that perfectionism that have been fruitful for students. I mean, the concept of Sabbath, like the whole Sabbath narrative in the Old Testament, is these people were trapped in an empire, Egypt, and they had to make bricks every day. And the story was, you are what you produce, right? You are equal to the bricks that you produce. And every time I bring that up with students, I'm like, can anybody relate to that? It's just like lightning, So the concept of Sabbath is an invitation that your identity is beloved of God, and to savor and enjoy community and God, instead of like your identity is tied to whether you get that grade or whether you're whatever. I think we have a really potent story that's an alternative to what drives a lot of the perfectionism. So those are a couple initial thoughts. Yeah, thank you. Do you want to answer your own question at all? Do you have any ideas? No? Okay. Thank you for the question. All right, I'm gonna keep going here. This kind of, let's see. This kind of connects to that last question. One other thing I wanted to name that I hear most of us experiencing is the way this life experience of busyness is having an impact on young people's mental health. Sometimes that's because of involvement in so many activities. Sometimes for some students, that's because of financial, like they're babysitting, right? And they're working and they're trying to go to school. There's lots of reasons that young people's schedules are packed. That can have a lot of impacts. One of the ways I see it impacting us very practically is like low buy-in to the things we offer as churches and ministries, is trying to compete with the huge buffet of things that young people are committing to is really challenging. So just a couple of responses I'm curious about or noticing. One is that, if young people aren't just going to show up out of obligation anymore, how do we try to invite them to co-create things that they actually have ownership of, right? How do we solicit things that they're driving? Because I think sometimes they're more likely, not guaranteed, but they're probably more likely to attend something that they have contributed to and name that they want, than something that we have set up without listening to or consultation with them. So that's one thing, is how do we co-create programming with youth? Here's a little picture of some of our students doing yoga. This is just an example of like doing some listening sessions and hearing what they want more of. And yoga is one of those things. So co-creating programming can maybe help us compete a little bit with the busyness. I already mentioned Sabbath teaching and practices. I wanted to put this up here. I don't know if I've actually done this with a large group, but I've seen a couple youth groups do this practice called drains and wells. And so this is almost like you could set up a time where you help students do sort of an audit on their time. This could probably take an hour, but you could even color code it if you wanted to. If they like bring their calendar and kind of make a graphic of their calendar, and then have them do some reflection, right? And sort them into categories. Wells are places where you draw energy and health from, and drains are things that are draining you, right? And so those bolds are just sort of some prompting questions. But I just find myself wondering, if many of them are overwhelmed and busy, could we give them a space to kind of audit their time and even think about, is there like one thing you want to do less of, or like maybe quit in this next season, or something you want to commit to taking up that would be helpful, that would be a quote unquote well for you. So how do we develop spiritual practices to help them deal with the busyness and kind of, instead of being like tugged around by it, have some exercise some agency with that? Mandy said, would you be willing to share this document? Yeah, I'm pretty sure I could. Maybe Amy could send it out. Amy, could you if I send you attachments, could you send them to this group?
Yes.
Cool. Yes, Mandy, I would be happy to share that. Cool. All right, I'm gonna pause and see. Anybody want to jump in and name other ways that you're seeing us as a Christian community be able to respond to the challenge of busyness and mental health issues related to that? Okay. Well, I have one other thing I want to kind of put forward. And so I'm going to share my screen again. Here we go. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to mention is I wanted to talk a little bit about male mental health. And so I'm going to give a couple sort of caveats to this and then share a few things that I noticed or have been wondering about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about male mental health for 5 or 10 minutes and solicit your responses. So a few things I want to note. One is that I'm honing in on male mental health, but that does not mean that all other mental health isn't important, right? I'm very aware that female mental health is something that we need to pay attention to and prioritize. I'm also aware that LGBTQIA mental health is a serious challenge in our state and throughout the country. And so I'm honing in on this, but not to suggest that this needs to be prioritized over, right, these other populations. But I'm bringing it up partially because it's just been something that, as I'm listening, has kept coming up in the last, especially 2 years, as I've been working with groups of young people. And then the other thing I think I'm learning is not to think of this in a sort of an either or binary way, but that I'm learning that there are a lot of young men struggling. And when young men aren't doing well, that usually means that the people around them aren't doing well, right? That means that they're not going to be as healthy boyfriends and partners and brothers and sons and pastors and leaders and XYZ. And so I think I'm moving more and more towards this like rising tide will lift all ships kind of approach. That's like, if we ignore some, I think, the acute mental health suffering of men in our communities, everyone's going to keep losing because that's going to come out sideways and hurt a lot of people in our communities. So those are just a couple of kind of notes about male mental health as I'm thinking. A few thoughts. Here we go. So I'm going to present some observations. I've done some listening sessions with Youth Academy students and alumni, as well as some reading. So this isn't peer-reviewed research. This is me saying, I've had a few group conversations with like 8 to 10 teen men and then a number of one-on-ones. But these are all listening sessions where I've been particularly asking about masculinity these young people's identity as men and their mental health. So I'm just going to offer some patterns that I've noticed of these, probably talking to 25 young men. So yeah, a few things I've noticed as themes. The most common theme I noticed in the last 2 years was men holding in emotions. I've heard a lot of teen men that I've talked to say that their role models rarely cry, and a lot of them name that they have, like, they can't cry, right, or don't know how to cry, and they're in cultures where they're scared of being judged by others for showing emotions, and articulating a sense that they feel like in their communities men lack spaces, especially spaces with other males, to name and share emotions. Something that came up a number of times in conversation listening sessions was that fathers, for better and for worse, seem like oftentimes played an important role in most of these students' understandings of their masculinity. Maybe that's not a shocker, but I heard that a lot. There were a few students in some of these conversations that named sexism in their churches, and I would say there is sexism in every church. It's my opinion, but a few students named being aware of that. There were also a number of students I heard conversely naming that the church or like their faith was a positive force in their lives that kept them away from abusive, disrespectful, violent behavior towards women, and seems to be nurturing their capacity for respect, humility, and care, which I think is really good news for me about the church, or these young people's churches. I noticed that rarely did a student bring up Jesus. It occasionally came up, but I had a question that I asked a lot of them, like, who are your models for healthy maleness? And I think I maybe had one or two students named Jesus, which is interesting. I think that's something we should just be curious about it. If a lot of these young people grew up in church every week, what does that mean? So this is one of them that really sent me down a rabbit trail that I'll share in just a minute more about. But as I listened, I heard probably the most consistent theme talked about way more than Jesus was a couple of these male influencers online, especially a guy named Andrew Tate, who a lot of these teens said these influencers, these people on these online platforms, YouTube, TikTok, whatever, had a lot of influence on their friends, as an example of what they would name as like negative masculinity that's disrespectful, uncomfortable with male vulnerability. And so I want to name what I'm coming to believe is, if you're interacting with a male who's like 15 to 22, that means they came of age online between the ages of 10 and 15 during the pandemic, and likely with access to the internet. And so if you're talking to a young man, my sense is there's like an 80% chance that they were at least exposed to, if not saturated in this like manosphere, Andrew Tate online influencer content. Like, I've just started to be like, I should assume it. Like, this isn't part of the millennial, at least for me, millennial vernacular, but you should more likely than not assume that they were exposed to some of this like negative male influencer content, right? Just know that that's part of their universe, probably. The other thing I wanted to name is that there were several really articulate students I talked to who kind of saw the way that conservative Christian groups saw the pain of young men, but then offered a narrative that blamed the wrong things, right? Blaming culture, being like, we're suffering because of trans people, right? Or we're suffering because of feminism. And so it's like, I think in some ways, some more conservative communities are taking the suffering more seriously, but then misdiagnosing the root causes. Which and often I've experienced some of this group ignoring economic, racial, and ableist issues, right? Like, my opinion is one of the biggest reasons why, like, for male rage right now is economic issues, and that doesn't have anything to do with trans people existing, right? But the suffering is still there. So those are just a few observations. I want to, one more. Most of the students that I talked to indicated that future conversations with male peer affinity groups in a context of confidentiality would be helpful for them. Like, would you like to keep doing this? Yeah, I would like to keep doing this. I'd like to have another conversation, right? So my sense in general was like there was a hunger there. I already mentioned the trigger warning. I wanted to read a little quotation from this book called Boy Mom. I'm really enjoying this book. It's challenging me. It's really interesting. It's a woman who like identifies as a feminist and also has 3 young sons and is kind of digging into these conversations. But I want to read a quotation from her. If you give me just a second. Let's see. So I'm gonna read a quotation from her doing research on kind of a dark corner of the male influencer culture called incel culture. So incel stands for involuntarily celibate. And so that's a whole subculture of thousands and thousands, probably millions of men online who have sort of bought into this particular worldview that like they're involuntarily celibate and negatively framing, like basically blaming women for that. So you'll hear a little bit more about that. I'm going to read a couple paragraphs. But this has been revelatory for me too, to know like a lot of young people at least understand this language and know these spaces exist. So incel, INCEL, involuntarily celibate. So listen to this. Incels have their own founding doctrine, a philosophy they call black pill, derived from a wider manosphere ideology known as the red pill. The red pill is a reference to a scene in the film The Matrix, in which Keanu Reeves' character gets to choose between 2 pills. A blue one, which would keep him in a dream-based existence, or a red one, which would awaken him to the harsher truths of the, quote, real world. In the manosphere online, taking the red pill refers to the moment when a man awakens to the reality that he's been sold a lie, that it is not men who hold the privilege and power in society, but women and specifically feminists. The incel's philosophy builds on this worldview with the addendum that women are capricious and shallow creatures only interested in men's looks, and a man's level of sexual success is predetermined by his genes. In this view, male desirability is a strict hierarchy with incels at the bottom. In this schema, genetically blessed and sexually successful men are called chads. They are tall, square-jawed, and masculine, and the attractive women they sleep with are called Stacys. Incels generally see themselves as short or overweight or otherwise failing to live up to male beauty standards. As they see it, their genetically bleak prospects force the incels to choose between a few basic options. One is to, quote, look max, which can mean anything from lifting weights to dangerous leg lengthening or facial masculization surgery. Another is copes, an incel term meaning any coping mechanism from venting to their buddies online to sex tourism in Southeast Asia. When the coping stops working, the final option is to rope or die by suicide, the topic of an alarming number of posts. The extremes aren't hard to find. There's a fair smattering of horrifying posts: violent racism, anti-Semitism, rape fantasies, all flavors of misogyny, including a totally emotionless, painstakingly argued 1,000-word deep dive into whether advocating for the legalized torture of women violates the First Amendment. So, really heavy stuff. And we could spend the whole afternoon unpacking everything within that. And I think it's important to say, you know, every teenage boy you run into doesn't, I'm not saying everyone believes that, but I think that like Andrew Tate, who gets like 30 million views per post, that's the beginning of that logic that can lead some young men onto those message boards and feed the algorithm that you end up seeing the being exposed continually to that kind of worldview, right? And so I think we have to disabuse ourselves of kind of naive notions and say, if you're 16 to 22 years old and you grew up with a smartphone, there's a decent chance you were at least exposed to these ideologies, right? And that's part of what I think is adversely affecting male mental health. I want to read a quotation. So I was reading that, and then I'm having these conversations with teen boys, and there was one teen boy who it was like almost like it's just such a perfect alignment. It's like he was reading my research basically. So I was asking him in a conversation. I guess this wasn't a one-on-one conversation. This was feedback from one of our sessions that was like written. So this is just a teen boy offering some feedback that I thought was really helpful. Second here. Let's see. Yeah, I will. I'm just going to read this to you. So this is a teen boy reflecting on just kind of his upbringing, and he says, "I was really influenced by Andrew Tate and right-wing influences online in middle school. When you are a 13-year-old and you really want a girlfriend but you can't get one, the manosphere is appealing because it tells you that your problems are someone else's fault. That it's feminism's fault because they teach women to hate men, or trans people's fault for emasculating men. 13-year-old, it's a more appealing message than realizing you need to be held accountable for your actions and to grow and evolve in order to be in a romantic relationship. I think my dad's example, being at the Simpson Youth Academy, and stories about Jesus in the church helped me to evolve. In those places, I saw men who could be both traditionally strong and also vulnerable. People who could act, change a situation with power, but could also cry and suffer and not be okay. Men who could laugh at themselves and who modeled caring for other people." So yeah, I think for me, like, there are a lot of ways that the church falls short or like actively perpetuates sexism. But I also think I continue to be like, the local church can make a difference. It's like it's an alternative, right, to these models. And so I want to commend that to us and say, like, us doing our work matters. Like, the work that we do really matters in young people's lives, all of them, including young men. So I want to be sensitive to our time. But I guess those are three things that came up: was algorithm-based social media, busyness, and then this kind of male mental health piece. And the dark content online are three things I'm thinking about. I am going to show you one other thing as you get ready to leave. If this has been helpful, just a little plug. A lot of this stuff came from my work at the Simpson Youth Academy. As I mentioned, it's a 10-day residential program at Simpson for sophomores, juniors, and seniors in high school that focuses on college preparation, faith and leadership, mental health, vocational discernment. So I would love for you to think about this, because we're right at the beginning of recruitment season, and people like you nominating students is what kind of gets them connected to a community that's life-giving and supportive. So please shoot me an email if you have any students that you think would benefit from this program. And then just to mention that this is being put on by the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa. So Amy's our host, and you don't have to be Episcopalian, but especially if you are, remember that we offer like Camp Epic in the summer and a number of other activities that are providing a lot of what we've been discussing in terms of community and support. And this is part of the mental health ministry of the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa that has a lot of great resources as well. So I'd encourage and commend all those resources to you. And 12:59, 1 minute early. I'll pause and see any very last questions, comments. Yeah, Matt.
Yeah, Eric, what's the age range for the youth academy that you're recruiting?
Yeah, so if a student this fall semester is a sophomore, junior, or senior, they can be nominated. Anything else y'all need? Well, thank you. Don't be a stranger. Reach out to Amy, reach out to myself if you want to talk more, brainstorm, or whatever. But thank you all for your work. It's really important. And take care of yourselves too. Amy, you have anything else? All right. Have a good day, y'all. Thank you.